This is a true story, told to me by a man who had been working as a murder investigator for over 30 years at the time. I was told this story after asking what the creepiest case he had ever been involved in was. This happened in the late 80s, in a part of the country that is mostly covered in dense pine forest. On the highway between cities in this part of the country, you rarely come across towns. There are stretches that seem to go on forever, with only pine trees as far as you can see. A young girl in her early 20s was taking a motor coach home. This happened just as winter was approaching and it was freezing outside after nightfall. This girl lived in one of these really small communities that you pass along the highway, but during the bus trip, she fell asleep and missed her stop. Looking at her watch, she realized that they had passed it only recently, and that if she were to get off, she would be able to walk back in approximately 3 hours. Either that, or get off in the next city, where she didn't know anyone or had any place to stay. She explained all of this to the bus driver, who pulled off at the next parking space and then let her out. That was the last time anyone saw her. Almost 15 years later, long after the search for her has been given up, she is stumbled upon by a hiker. Her dead body was found tied to a tree, very deep into the dense, almost impassable forest. The autopsy showed no signs of physical violence of any kind. Someone had just left her there, tied to a tree, alive. This didn't happen to me, but I was involved in it. The victim was actually my girlfriend, and I got the story from her later. At the time my girlfriend and I were attending college together. It was a small school in a pretty quiet place, so most of the students were from the area. My girlfriend Katie was one of them. I came from a distance and so lived in a dorm at the college. Katie and I would hang out together in my dorm between classes, and even some evenings and weekends when we wanted to be together, but didn't feel like going out. It was a Friday night, and both of us, being pretty introverted, decided not to do anything crazy, so we planned to spend the night in my room with each other, as my roommate was out that night. She wanted some time to go home after classes, and assured me that she would be back around 8 o'clock. Katie had a car, but she never liked driving. Unless she had to pack her instrument, she usually took the bus. That Friday night, she had a pretty unnerving experience in doing so that freaked the two of us out for a long while after it happened. She was a smart girl, definitely didn't look like a college-aged student. She was short, thin, and quiet. Standing alone at a bus stop in the dark was probably not ideal, but she preferred that over taking her own car. She waited for the bus, innocent as a rose, when a van drove past her. And then it drove by again, and again, and again. She was a bit suspicious, but told herself that he was probably just lost. The van then pulled over right in front of the stop, and the driver rolled his window down.
"Isn't it cold out here?"
he asked.
"The bus is always late. Hop in and I'll give you a ride."
Katie declined politely and took a few steps back, trying to show him that she wasn't interested in anything that he wanted. He asked again if she was absolutely sure that she didn't want to ride, and then he drove away after she turned him down again. The bus arrived moments later, and she was relieved to step on. To her horror, she then noticed the same van right behind the bus. The van followed the bus directly, and Katie texted me to explain the situation. I could tell that she was very scared. I offered to stay on the phone with her to calm her nerves, and she accepted. We talked about school and things to get her mind off of it, and once her stop came, she felt safe enough to hang up the phone and walk the short distance to the college. When she arrived at my dorm room, she was hysterical. It took me over an hour to comfort her enough to get the story out of her, and this is what she told me. The van had stopped following the bus after getting stuck at a red light. giving the bus a chance to get ahead. However, after getting off at her stop, the van sped up to her. He was driving like a maniac at this point. The bus had already pulled away when the van stopped next to her. It had pulled over right where she intended to go to get to the college, so in a panic, she bolted the other way, and the driver raced after her. When she turned her head to look behind her, she noticed he was holding a butcher knife and waving it in front of him in her direction. She did a wide turn to get back on track to the college, the man following close behind. Lucky for her, he lost his footing on an icy patch on the road, and his fall delayed him enough for her to get far enough ahead. When he got back up, he didn't chase after her again, but instead yelled out,
"I will find you."
Since then, she has always taken her own car instead of the bus. When I was growing up, my little brother, who was 3 at the time, used to sleepwalk through our house at night. He would walk down to the basement where I slept and crack open my door between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. He would then slowly push it open and shuffle inside. When I would ask him what he was doing, he would always stare at the floor and say, "Where's Mom?" I would tell him that she was upstairs, and he would repeat, "Where's Mom?" Each night I would take him back upstairs and lead him back to bed where he would fall asleep. One night, at about 1 a.m., I awoke to hear crying at the bottom of the stairs. I walked out to investigate, and he was sitting on the bottom step. I asked him what was wrong, and he again asked, "Where's Mom?" I told him that she was upstairs and that we should go get her. "No," he said, staring at the floor. "There's a bloody head following me." "What?" I asked. He looked up from the floor, stared me right in the eyes, opened his mouth, and let out the shrillest, blood-curdling scream I have ever heard in my life. It scared the living hell out of me. It was so loud that the whole family got out of their beds to see what was going on. After that, I never asked him again what he was doing downstairs. I would just take him immediately back to his room. Several months ago, my cat went missing in the woods, and I had to go look for him. It was late at night, and the moon was a thin crescent, so the only source of light was my flashlight. I had seen my cat several times, but he seemed to be scared of something. Every time I got close, he would run further away. At a certain point, he got scared of something, and then ran back towards the house. I started to make my way back, and then I saw a man. He was just standing there, absolutely still. He had nondescript brown hair and a tweed jacket on. I could make out all of his facial features except his eyes, where there seemed to just be a shadow. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. I then said, "I can see you, you know," and was greeted with silence. I turned and walked a few steps, and then turned around. He was closer. I turned and walked some more, and then looked again. This time, he was partially hidden behind a tree. I didn't need any more warning. I booked it back to my house, where my cat desperately wanted to come inside. We went inside and I locked the doors and sat on my couch until I calmed down. Ever since that night, every few weeks, I hear a noise at my window. A slow, loud, rhythmic tap. There's no trees out there, and most of the nights that it's happened, there's no wind. Every time, I've been too scared to look, probably for the better. The last thing I want to see is a man with a tweed jacket, with no eyes. When I was young, my grandma came over to our house to babysit me one night. Nothing unusual happened the whole night, But when my mom got home, she checked the answering machine, and there was a message a few minutes long. The message was just the sound of my grandmother and myself laughing hysterically for the entire message. Like I said, the night was normal, and there wasn't any moment when the phone rang or we laughed hysterically for minutes on end. Once when I was a teenager, I was waiting at an abandoned gas station in downtown Akron to meet a dealer to buy some weed. This was in about 1993 or 1994, so payphones were still functional and in pretty common use. As I was waiting, the payphone in the parking lot started ringing. Bear in mind, it was at about sunset on the outskirts of downtown, and not another single person was around. Out of curiosity, I picked up the phone. The man on the other line asked, "Is this Chad?" "My name isn't Chad," I said. The man ignored me and said, "Chad, I want you to do bad things to me." I stated again that I wasn't Chad and asked him what he wanted and if he knew that he was calling a payphone. He ignored me again and went into very explicit and specific detail about all the things he wanted Chad to do to him. I was laughing and told him again that I wasn't Chad. Finally, he said he knew for sure that I was Chad and described to me what Chad looks like. He described me perfectly down to the color of my shirt and what type of shoes I was currently wearing. I immediately hung up and looked around. There was no one. I mean, not a single person anywhere. I got into my car and got the hell out of there. I have Google Voice set to transcribe any voicemails I get and send them to me via text message. So I get a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail, and the transcription that it sends me via text message is, "Hi, Fritz." So later that day I check my Google Voice page and listen to the voicemail. It is 30 seconds of absolute silence. Google Voice transcribed the block of silence into the greeting, "Hi, Fritz." The creepy part about it is, the only person who called me by my nickname Fritz was my grandfather, who has been dead for 3 years. One night I was having this really odd dream. It was one of those ridiculously long dreams that seems like it lasts for years while you are asleep. This one lasted a whole lifetime. I watched a woman live her life. I watched as she was a child, as she grew up. I watched her go through school, college. I watched her social life evolve. I watched her romance and her marriage and her pregnancy. I watched her live her midlife, raise her children, and then grow old. It was a pretty normal life. I didn't see any trauma. I didn't remember how she died, but the moment it was over, I woke up. I had to go to the bathroom really bad, probably 4 a.m, barely awake, and went to the bathroom. As I sat there and peed, I saw her face looking at me through the window. The woman, she was there, old, wrinkled, wide-eyed and gaping mouth with the most horrible, scornful face looking at me. It didn't faze me at the time. I got up and walked back to my bed and fell right back asleep. I didn't realize until the next morning the horrifying thing that I had seen. One night, a friend I went to med school with was driving back home from his girlfriend's house when a large dog ran out in front of his car. My friend had no time to swerve and hit the dog head on. Being an animal lover, he jumped out of the car to see if the dog is all right. But before he can come around to the front, he sees the dog get up on 2 legs and run off into the field next to him. He has been telling this story for years, and I know that he is telling the truth. Every time I've seen him tell the story, he has had a very strange expression on his face. I was working late at the bank, 11 p.m., last one in. It's pitch black outside and the bank is essentially isolated, far away from anything nearby. I am very alone. I'm walking around installing new printers, and all of a sudden the security monitors in my IT room turn off. I get up and go check the plugs to make sure nothing came loose. As I lean over to inspect the cables, all the lights in the building die, and I'm plunged into darkness. My heart starts racing from the shock, and I feel the adrenaline building. I reach into my pocket to get my phone to use as a light, but before I get it out, the backup lights turn on, and the whole building is dimly lit by the faint green glow of backup lights. The lights are very weak, but it's good enough to see. A green-tinged blackness. I can make out the objects in the room, though most things are still in shadow. I leave my phone where it is. I forget the monitors and start walking toward the banking hall, where all of the tills are, because that's where the circuit breakers are, and I guess it's up to me to fix this. The bank is built like a bomb shelter, with thick concrete walls and multiple heavy lock metal doors. I have to swipe my ID card multiple times to get to the hall, and I'm scared that I could get locked in between 2 doors if the power fail has messed up that system. I'm quietly thinking about what I would do if such a thing happened, and I'm still a bit jumpy from the shock earlier. I'm looking over my shoulder and studying the shadows that I walk past, and that's when I hear a blood-curdling scream. It's long and loud and primal. I can almost feel it vibrating in the air. It's coming from the banking hall. I freeze in place right before the final door, freaking out, and just stare at the gray-green lock of the metal door as I listen. The scream seems never-ending. It feels like the scream has been going on for 3 minutes or more without taking a breath, but the adrenaline makes telling time difficult. I try and control my breathing. I check behind me down the shadowy concrete green corridor I came from and decide that I need to press on. I turn to the door, swipe my card, and open the door as fast as I can, bursting through, ready for anything. I manage to scan half of the room as I open the door before I'm blinded by a strong white light. The scream suddenly and abruptly stops. My eyes adjust and I see that the light was the main lights reactivating. I'm staring into a normal room. The silence was terrifying, heart pounding in my chest and my ears. But everything seems in order. The white light bouncing pleasantly from letters on tables, the computers turned off and quiet, the bulletproof glass, all fine. Door to the front, still locked. The scream was gone, and whoever was screaming, unaccounted for. And the lights were back on. Being quite freaked out at this point, I left out the back way in a panic and called it a night. The scariest moment of my life happened while my friend and I were camping in eastern Canada as teenagers. We decided to sleep in this abandoned camper we found deep in a large forest that was near our town. It had been there for so long that small trees had grown around it. We had stumbled across it when we were exploring a few months back and thought it would be cool and brave to sleep in it for one night. So one weekend, we did. We arrived after dark because we had gotten lost trying to find the camper. We had a really low-power flashlight, so it made it even more difficult. Once we finally found it, we opened the rusty door and stepped in. The sounds inside the camper were shrill and echoed. There were typical camper things strewn about, cups, empty cans, and old novels that were falling apart. Already tired, we holed up in one end of the camper where the bed area had originally been before the cushions had rotted away to almost nothing. A long hallway stretched the length of the camper, so we could basically see from end to end. It was a miserable night. There were several rats living in there. I saw them staring at us from a chewed-out part of the ceiling. When the wind blew outside, the camper would shriek and groan. We even thought we heard a bear outside, walking around. Still, we pretended to be brave and acted like we were having a good time, but we were both on edge. At some point I woke up from an uncomfortable sleep. I sat up to adjust myself when I noticed some movement out of the corner of my eye. At the other end of the camper, there was a small window, and as I looked at it, I saw a man's silhouette. He was clearly staring straight at me from outside. At first I thought maybe it was a weird shape of a tree or something, but when I moved a bit to get a better look, the person clearly reacted and then froze. My heart was pumping, and I woke up my friend immediately, saying, "Someone is here," over and over in a whisper, not taking my eyes off of the man outside. My friend woke up immediately and nodded towards the window. He saw him too. We whispered frantically about who it could be and why he was staring at us, and for the next 10 minutes, no joke, we stared him down. The longer we stared at him, the more frightened we got. Occasionally he would move, but always keeping his eyes locked on us. Eventually I shouted at him, "Hey!" No reaction. My friend was braver than me and decided to shine the flashlight at him. As soon as he did, the man ducked and disappeared. We slowly got up, packed up our things, and sprinted out into the dark woods. I looked behind me several times, but as far as I know, the man did not follow. I was in Bermuda in the off-season with my mom, dad, and little brother. I must have been about 5 years old or so. It was before my other brother and sister were born. I remember the hotel was empty. I remember the beach was empty. Most of this place was empty. I don't recall ever seeing anyone else. I was on the beach with my parents and my little brother. I ran off to explore, and I saw my mom further ahead on the beach. She yelled at me, "Come over here." There was a thicket area of scrubby bushes and trees along the beach. She went up into it and disappeared. There was this cement square with pipes or vents or something coming out of it. I walked over to it and saw her standing there. As I approached her, I felt that something was wrong. She motioned for me to continue coming towards her, and I didn't want to be defiant, so I pretended I was really interested in the pipe things and said out loud, "I wonder what these are for," or something like that. As soon as she walked further out of view, my dad came up from behind me on the beach and yelled, "What are you doing? Don't wander off like that." He took my hand roughly and led me back to the beach, where my mother was sitting in a chair. I still don't know what happened or who I saw. The woman looked exactly like my mom, but something felt wrong. I worked at a campground on the night shift, 12 a.m. to 8 a.m. every night. It wasn't bad. I would bring in my PS2 and game a good portion of the night, only having to deal with 1 or 2 people on busy nights. It was just me in this little 8x8 shack, with nothing around but dark, all night. My first week there, the other third shift guy who was quitting told me about this payphone a few feet from the shack where I worked. He said that it rang every night at 4:17 a.m. exactly. Just once. It would only ring once. It was probably just an automated test call, he guessed. He's never answered it himself. I go for a few months with the job. It was the middle of summer, so most nights I had the windows closed so I couldn't hear the payphone go off. In mid-August, I started leaving the windows open during the night. Sure enough, at 4:17 a.m. every morning, the phone would ring once. The ring even sounded creepy somehow. One night, I got up the nerve to answer the phone. I set an alarm at 4:15 and would go wait at the phone until it rang. When it did, I answered it, but there was no sound, just dead air, like someone was on the other line but wasn't saying anything. I said hello a few times and then hung up. I did this every night for a week with the same exact results. I didn't think anything of it and then left it alone after that for about a month. The first week of October, I decided to answer the phone once again. I set my alarm, and when the time came, I answered it. Hello? Hello? Then I heard what sounded like someone inhaling and exhaling through clenched teeth. The voice I heard was rough and sounded like he had gargled gravel. He said my name, my complete name, first, middle, and last. It was a voice I had never heard before, and I will never forget. I was too scared to say anything and hung up the phone. I rattled some change into the payphone and hit star 69. The number had come from California. I live in Indiana. I used to live in a house next to an abandoned train station, and one day a friend of mine and I decided to explore it. We had done this before, but this time something was different. One of the old train wagons that we had seen before had curtains in the windows when they didn't before. Naturally, I tried to peek inside, but as I got close to the windows, the curtains suddenly flung open and an elderly woman stared back at me with a terrified look on her face. I have honestly never been more scared in my entire life, and naturally I just sprinted the hell out of there. To this day, I have no idea why that woman was in there. Years later, I walked past the train station at night. It was such a creepy place. I haven't been back since. When I was 8, my mom, dad, and younger brother were visiting some relatives. We ended up staying the night, with my brother and I sleeping on cots near my parents' bed. In the middle of the night, I distinctly remember feeling incredibly cold and waking up. While attempting to rearrange my sheets, I looked up and saw my dad wide awake and staring intently at something behind me. When I turned to see, I saw several small little glowing eyes behind me. Turning back to my dad, we made eye contact and I jumped up into bed with him, but he did not move or speak at all. Even under the comforter, I was chilled to the bone. He was visibly tense and concentrating very hard, and I swear I could see the little glowing eyes moving closer. And then they reached my brother laying on his cot. When they did, I didn't feel as cold anymore, but I felt very strange, like a mix of dozens of emotions without being any particular one. I looked at my dad, who looked very sullen and sad. He put his arm around me and then went back to sleep. The next morning we were awoken by my brother throwing up all over the carpet. This continued for hours. He had a terrible fever, chills, and had a really hard time speaking. My father moved him downstairs and gave him some painkillers, but my brother said that it didn't work at all. About lunchtime, we decided to take an early leave and go home. Less than 20 minutes into the car ride, my brother said he felt completely fine again. My father and I talked about this a few years ago, and only more recently told my brother and my mom about it. We have since slept there in different rooms without incident, but my mom sleeping in there once on a trip had a similar experience. Vomiting, fever, chills, only to be fine minutes later after leaving the house. We don't sleep in that room anymore. It was going on 10, and I was taking my last patient back to her room. She was a little old lady who was stable enough to ride in a wheelchair, but definitely needed assistance on her feet. I got her back to her room and helped her into bed. I made sure she was comfortable and set the bed alarm before turning out the lights and leaving her room. I pulled the curtain behind me so as to not let too much light in, but not all the way so that I could still see her in bed from the hallway. Her nurse was in the room next door, and I needed to speak with her. While I was standing there, waiting for the nurse to come out of the other room, I distinctly saw a person walk past the curtain inside the old woman's room. The person was about the same height as the woman and had the same gray hair. At first I thought, she shouldn't be up walking around. Then I remembered the bed alarm was set. The room was totally silent, and when I looked in, I could see her still laying there, exactly where I had left her. She had not moved an inch, and the bed alarm was still armed. That's when I got the most intense, full-body chills of my life. The nurse came out of the other room. I gave her my message, and then booked it out of there. I was trying to sleep one night in my room back when I was younger and lived with my folks. I must have been about 17 or 18. I opened my eyes while rolling over to get comfortable, and I see a black figure just outside my door, who I thought was my stepfather. He had his hands up by his chest making the scary finger motions, like you might do sarcastically after a scary story, or a witch might do when casting a spell. Just moving fingers wildly in my direction. I should note that this figure had no defined shape. It looked like squiggles that moved in a vague shape, and I chalked it up to the lack of light. I look over and say, "What are you doing?" Thinking that he was just being really weird and trying to be creepy. In that moment, the person disappeared. They were gone. It was at that moment my heart sank, and I became petrified with fear. One of the few moments in my life that I was so scared out of my mind and could not comprehend what I had just seen. Me and some buddies were bored one night and decided to head out and poke around an abandoned mental hospital. The only way in was through the autopsy room. The rest of the place was pretty much sealed off. So we get inside, me, another guy, and two girls. As soon as we get into the autopsy room, one of the girls starts hyperventilating and crying. She said she just couldn't be there any longer. We tried everything we could to convince her that everything was going to be fine, to no avail. She wanted to leave, and she wanted to leave now. Disappointed, we started to leave. The two girls were walking in front of us, one trying to comfort the other, while me and the other guy were walking behind. I don't know what brought me to look back. Morbid curiosity, maybe. But I did. Now, I'll admit that it was dark, but the moon was out, so it wasn't pitch black. Still, I know what I saw. A window on the second floor, what looked like a face staring back at me. I looked for a good 10 seconds, stopped my buddy and had him look, without taking my eyes off of it, and asked him specifically, "Do you see that?" I thought I may have been seeing things, or maybe it was the trick of the light. But no, he saw it too, and we both stood there and stared for a good 20 seconds. I might have thought it was some kind of trick, but after 20 seconds or so, the face moved away from the window, and we ran away, passing the girls and screaming at them to get in the car. What were the chances that other people were exploring the same time as us? I don't know. All I know is I know what I saw. There was a person standing in that window, the second-story window, in an abandoned mental hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning. I have memories that are very early, and most of them are scary, but one memory is different. When I was very young, I'm talking between age 2 and 3, I used to see this man who looked just like my dad when he would hold his cheeks to make this goofy face. Only this guy's face was like that without holding it. I recall playing with Legos with my brother in our room, and the guy walking by the window, turning slowly to look in, bulging eyes, and just starts screaming. I would sit on the floor frozen in fear. My brother didn't see these things. And now that I think of it, this man I saw was never directly in front of me. I only saw him through windows. I am pretty sure that I was a child who hallucinated when they were very young. It was in my first year at university, completely new to the city and its surroundings. One evening, my friend and I decided to take a trip to the mall. It was 8 p.m., and we got on a bus that my friend claimed would take us to the mall. We ended up at an empty bus terminal, and it was around 10 o'clock at this time. We waited and waited for another bus to come, and there was no one there but us. A while later, an old man walked by and told us that since it's so late, another bus won't be coming for another hour or so. He told us to turn and walk down the road, and we would find another bus stop where a bus would come sooner. We followed his instructions and entered the single-lane road with tall trees on each side. There were only a few street lamps working, so the area was dimly lit. The road was sort of built on a slant. All we could see was the road and the trees on either side for a long distance. Once we arrived, we waited. My phone battery died, and my friend had forgotten hers in her dorm room. We were starting to think that there wouldn't be any bus coming, and started to panic. Then, as we were waiting, I turned around to see two kids with backpacks walking down the road. I was relieved to see them, and so was my friend. When they were close by, I asked them if they knew about any buses that might come. The kids were about 12 or 13 years old. One was a boy and the other was a girl. "Hey, do you know if there are any buses coming?" The boy responds, "Let me check." He takes his phone out of his pocket and is looking at it for a short time. Meanwhile, my friend started talking to the girl. "Where are you guys from?" The girl didn't respond. The boy eventually looked up and said that the bus would be here in 10 minutes. I turned my head to my friend and she was looking at me, and then I turned my head back to thank the boy, and they were gone. The girl and the boy were gone. Nowhere to be seen. I literally probably looked away for 1 second max. We both looked down the road, turned around and looked up the other way and by the trees. They had a fence around them. But even if they went there, we would have seen them. I literally looked away for a second. Needless to say, both of us were scared as hell until the bus arrived. It was the last bus, and it was around 12:17 a.m. when it finally showed up. I have never believed in paranormal activities, but I can't seem to find a reasonable explanation for this. I was living in an apartment with 3 roommates at the time. I was working all sorts of weird hours and would stay up late most nights. Our apartment had 2 hallways that formed a capital L. My room was at the top of the L. The bathroom was in the corner of where the lines meet. I left the bathroom one night to go back to my room, and just as I turned the bathroom lights off, there, standing in the hallway, next to the living room, was a teenage girl. She was wearing a white dress, just smiling at me. She didn't look evil, just a normal person standing there smiling at me. I freaked out and went running for my bedroom. About 20 minutes later, I finally came out of my room, turning all of the lights on as I went through the apartment searching for her. She was nowhere to be seen. I lived there for about another year, and I never saw her again. This happened when I was around 7 years old, and it was near the holidays. The house I grew up in had a basement. I left my pillow down there one day after watching movies and went to grab it later that evening. I grab the pillow and look up and see a man on the other side of the room, looking around, paying no attention to me. I'm staring, jaw wide open, completely petrified with fright. He looks up at me, notices that I can see him, and then drops his jaw lower than humanly normal, almost as if he was screaming, but no sound was coming out. I then ran up the stairs. I told everyone in the house, and they went down to look, but of course, he was gone. This happened to me when I was a junior in high school. It was December, and it had just started snowing that evening. My best friend and I were in debate class and getting ready for our state qualifiers that were the next day. We were writing our cases and, as usual, at each other's throats over the details. It was a stressful, tense evening. We finally finished our cases at about 3 a.m. Then, we went to my room for the night. Almost as soon as we get into my room, we hear what sounds like the water turning on the other side of the house. No big deal, probably my parents, I thought. Then, we hear the front door open. I told my friend, I bet my mom woke up and wanted some fresh air. She does that sometimes. I really thought that's what it was, until we heard incredibly heavy footsteps in my living room, headed towards my bedroom. They were not my mother or anyone else in my family. Then they stopped. My friend and I looked at each other and were both freaked out, just standing, frozen in my room. We moved closer to each other, and the footsteps started again, but this time they were running. We both flipped out, my bedroom door flew open, and we screamed. Nobody was there. We ran to the bathroom that's connected to my room. I closed and locked the door and stood against it. When we finally built up the courage to do it, we sprinted to my parents' room, crying hysterically. We obviously startled my parents awake. They said that neither of them had gotten up. My dad grabbed his gun out of the closet and then looked around the house. There was no sign of anyone. I heard this story from a girl that I met in Korea. One day she was walking home late one night after work. She lived in an apartment where they had an elevator. She got in the elevator, and when the door was about to close, a man with a red hoodie entered the elevator. He apologized for scaring her and asked which floor she was heading to. Without making any eye contact, she told him out of fear. As the elevator moved, he asked her if he could use her cell phone, and she declined and isolated herself in the corner. After seconds of silence, the elevator arrived to the floor below the one the girl was heading to, and the door opened. The guy slowly walked out of the door and then turned around facing her. He stared at her without any movement with a blank expression. Slowly the door started to close, and from the small gap right at the last second, she saw him turn and start walking up the stairs, pulling a knife out of his pocket. The elevator started to move up, and she frantically started to smash the closed door button. Unfortunately, the door opened anyway. She looked around, and he was nowhere to be seen. She ran to her apartment, went inside, and locked the door. She never saw the man again. My brother once lived in a flat in downtown Mount Clemens. The Clem was known to be a hot spot for baths back in the Depression era and was booming with activity. Nowadays, it has some run-down parts, and this is where my brother rented his flat. It was a giant, old, raggedy house which was now separated into multiple odd apartments. He always admitted to odd experiences. Cupboard doors opening up, things missing, but one peculiar oddity, that he was always missing his boxers from his drawer. He admitted that he thought his house was haunted. Never anything violent or disturbing, just odd things like his boxer shorts going missing. Later on, he started dating his future ex-wife. She started coming around, and he noticed that the oddities began to increase. New oddities began to occur. His girlfriend would always find her shoes, which were left on a mat inside the apartment, outside the door on the patio in the morning. She would always comment to my brother to stop putting her shoes outside. He knew what was going on, but he didn't want to frighten her. Things started to get worse. He comes home from work and his girlfriend was staying there while he was gone. She claims that the stove burner kept lighting itself. She would walk into the kitchen and it would be lit. She would turn it off and shortly later it would be lit again. Then, one night my brother wakes up in the middle of the night and sees his girlfriend sitting at the edge of the bed. Not just sees, but feels her near his feet, staring at him. He calls out for her to come back to bed. She doesn't respond, so he calls out louder, telling her to come to bed, and asked her what she was doing. His girlfriend then asks what he was doing. He turns and she's sleeping next to him. He turns back, and no one is at the end of the bed. Now, of course, he's freaked out, but doesn't want to scare his girlfriend from coming over to his house in the future. A few nights later, they're both sleeping, and he wakes up to his girlfriend screaming. He looks over and she's sleeping but thrashing around, holding onto her neck. He doesn't see anything, so he starts yelling and shaking her to wake up. After a few shakes, she wakes up crying and terrified. She starts telling my brother about how real her dream felt, that a woman was strangling her, telling her to get out, that she didn't belong there. Her neck had red marks on it, possibly from herself holding her neck, but they believed it to be from something else. My brother then comes clean with her. They decide to do some research and find out that the address that they lived in was an old brothel back in the day. My brother lived in that house for a few more weeks before he could locate a new place. She never came back to stay the night though, and he never experienced anything aggressive while there. Still, it's messed up. I know my brother, and I can tell when he's lying. This was legit, and when he talked about it, you could see the fear in his eyes. A couple years back, my best friend and I went on a road trip to the States for a music festival. We met up with some friends, saw lots of things and whatnot. One of our friends comes back home with us. He needed to get back home for school, and his buddies didn't want to head home yet. We decided to drive straight home in shifts. It took about 24 hours for the full drive. My story starts where I'm driving the night shift at about 2 a.m. It is a beautifully clear night. Full moon, no clouds, middle of summer. While noticing all of these conditions, I also noticed that we have followed the GPS onto a back road and driven into a very large valley. Open fields, not another car or house in sight. And it is important to note that we have not seen anyone or anything relating to human presence for a few hours. Upon entering this valley, we lose our satellite signal. We have no satellite radio, no GPS, and no cell signal either. However, I figure it doesn't really matter, as I know that we follow this road for a couple more hours. About 20 minutes after entering this valley, and after losing all of our connections, we come upon a bridge. As we get closer, I see a car pulled out on the side of the road. Not uncommon. People sleep in pullouts when they can. What is uncommon is this car has all of its windows blacked out. With all of the light from the moon, we should be able to see at least partially inside, but it was completely black. Getting closer, we also realized that it has no license plate that we can see. No big deal. We assumed that it was just abandoned out here. That is, until we pass this vehicle, and almost immediately its lights turn on, and it pulls out behind us on the road. Now this is where it gets creepy. This vehicle starts tailgating us, in the middle of nowhere, and we can't see who is inside. Again, we brush it off. Maybe he is lost, needs to follow someone out of the area, but it doesn't explain the windows being blacked out, or the lack of a license plate. With this car following us, I start to get an uneasy feeling, subtle at first, but growing stronger. Soon I start to feel very panicked, and I want to get away from this vehicle ASAP. It's important to note that I do not frighten easily. I do not panic. I felt panicked at this time because I felt that my life was in danger. I tried to push these feelings aside, as it seems like the silliest response to a possibly explainable situation. That is, until I see something in the middle of the road. Coming closer, we see what looks to be a body laying in the middle of the lanes. This is not a big road, and like I said, it was also a back road, still paved, but very small. At this moment, and at the sight of what appears to be a body in the road ahead, we start freaking out. I, in no way, am stopping for any reason in this desolate and isolated area. There are no other vehicles around other than the one following us, and I can see no housing or lights as far as the eye can see. No cell service, no satellite, nothing. By this time we are almost upon it. There is no room to go around as there are no shoulders on the road and deep ditches on the sides. And we are close enough to see now that it is a scarecrow. I drive over it and continue on. This car, small enough to go around it, continues to follow us. I speed up, and then it speeds up. I slow down, and then it slows down, until I punch the gas. After about 2 minutes of this, the car slows down, does a U-turn, and then drives back the opposite direction. Now my passenger turns to me and says, "I swear I saw spikes in that thing." Lucky for us, we were driving a very big truck. The wheel span was bigger than the scarecrow on the road, and we never even touched it. It was another half hour before we reached cell services, and the satellite picked back up. It wasn't until we reached home at 5 a.m. that we remembered during this time that there had been a couple of missing people reported in our province. Ones who were on vacation and driving home from the States who never made it home or were ever found. I and my passengers fully believe that we escaped some crazy Wolf Creek type of situation. We contacted the police about it and ended up making a full police report. However, we were unable to pinpoint the exact location. There wasn't anything they could really do other than file the report. We definitely didn't want this to happen to anyone else, as it was creepy as hell. My best friend once told me a story I'll never forget. He used to play the games on his mom's cell phone when he was a young child, and one night he fell asleep with it in bed. His mom found him sleeping and took the phone back. Later that night, she was looking at the phone pictures and found a picture of this crazy half-face close-up of a stranger and my friend sleeping in the background in his bed.
June. My partner Johnny comes upstairs and finds it's cute how I'm checking him out on OkCupid. I'm confused as I haven't logged in lately, like in months. How could I have been looking at his account on OkCupid? So I log in and check it out. There's a list of 7 or so people that have also been checked out from my account today alone. Johnny is included. and also someone I work with. Well, that's embarrassing. Nope, wasn't me. So it's time to change my password. The next day at work, I was sure to bring it up and laugh about the fact that my OkCupid account was hacked to the person who was last in my viewed list. I didn't want this person thinking that I actually looked at his account. We work too closely together, and I already get the impression that he may see me more than just his boss. It always pleased him that his luggage tags printed his middle name and first initials as Christ T. This is not the type of person who should see his own name written out like he's God's gift to earth. I'll refer to him as Chris. Chris just laughed off the OkCupid hacking comment I made. I found it strange. He had no questions or comments on the subject. Most people would at least ask if you've changed your password, but nothing from Chris. So I brushed off the situation, and a few days later, I was out of office for work. Johnny messages me saying that it happened again, that I checked him out on OkCupid. No, I didn't, but I changed my password again. Now it's July. It's a weekend. I'm having a lazy morning in bed with Johnny, and I get a Facebook notification. Your account has been logged in from a new location. The IP address points to Chris's hometown. My heart's racing. What the hell is going on? I take care of the Facebook password and screenshotted the notification. Later that night, I get a text from Chris. Happy 4th, boss. I assume he's drunk. I'm worried about being caught having his access to my Facebook revoked so quickly. No, it can't be him doing this. It's just a coincidence, right? Johnny is convinced it's Chris, but that means someone I work with on a very small team is targeting me. This will make work nearly impossible. I can't talk to anyone at work about this. I'll have no way to run my departments. The situation will get minimalized. Chris drank a lot. I'd seen it at work events or when we just travelled just the two of us. He often got out of hand, but everyone just brushed it off. He's young. It was funny. We've all had those nights. But as long as you can show up at work the next day, it's fine. I brought it up with him once. Hey Chris, you need to be more cautious about the way you drink at work events. And then he didn't speak to me for 3 days. I offended him. I told him he's not allowed to have fun at work events. He told me when he finally snapped, and I recoiled. He's 3 times my size, and we're in a secluded space at work. One time whilst travelling with just the two of us, I got very sick. I told him I wouldn't make it for our dinner, so Chris offered to pick something up from a nearby store. He knocked on my room door and handed me the water he got me. He tried to make small talk as I thanked him and indicated that I was going to lie down. It was apparent by his stance in my hotel room doorway that he wished to come in. He moved an inch closer, and I said goodnight, shut my door, and locked every lock I could. It wasn't the only time that he made me feel uncomfortable. I hadn't noticed any other accounts being hacked for a while. I was cautioned around Chris, even disassociated when I could. I avoided work outings if he was going, and I would just back out of lunch plans that he decided to go to once he knew I was going. But we often had to work very closely. We were a team after all, and I couldn't do my job without him, and him without me. Come November, Johnny was online, checking out his FetLife account one evening. He saw I was also online via the old messenger they used to have, and Johnny asked me if I'm logged in. I'm not. Again, my heart's racing. It's different this time though. The violations are beginning to feel commonplace, normal, expected. But this hacking is extreme. No one outside my FetLife friends know about this account. Definitely no one I work with, and there are some faceless nude photos of me there. I reached out to FetLife. They gave me the IP address of the last login. It's the same as the Facebook hack. Shit. I can't avoid this anymore. I can't just pretend it's just coincidences. But I need proof it's Chris. All I have is an IP address and an intuition. I can't take that to HR. The police, maybe? Will they help? Or will it make matters worse if they need to contact my employer? I start looking into the logging history of any account that tracks it. My bank account. Why is there an iPhone logged into it daily? I don't have an iPhone, but Chris does. Shit. This is real. This is happening. So I call the bank when I'm at work. I ask them about the unknown logging, and Chris is at his desk, right next to mine. The conversation is easily overheard. I hang up with the bank, and they can't help. Chris doesn't say a thing. Under normal conditions, I feel that a co-worker would inquire. Wow, is everything okay? Did you change your password? Did money go missing? Nothing from him, though. So out of character. He's always interested in my personal life, but at this moment he chooses to remain silent? The next weekend, I wake up to a phone call. The caller is calling from my phone number. My heart skips a beat, but I answer. No one responds. I just hear breathing. I'm losing my sanity. I've spent weeks, months researching IP addresses and how I might be able to use the information I have. I've lost sleep. I can't focus at work. Johnny is worried about me and my safety, and so am I. But what do I do? Johnny suggests we go to the police. I don't want to, but I'm at a dead end. The officer is kinder and more receptive to the situation than I expected. This serves as a reminder to me that this is a big deal. I shouldn't minimize it in my own thoughts. She takes the report, every detail, and they will use the IP to subpoena the ISP. Weeks go by. The officer on my case claims there's no crimes. The ISP records were never obtained. December comes along. My work email keeps doing this strange thing. Messages I've read keep being marked as unread. Weird. Is it him or just multiple devices I used to check it on? I don't know. I can't tell. The server doesn't keep a login history, that I can see at least. Should I talk to IT? I know them well. They will help. But that will make the situation real and known at work. No, not yet. I can't bring myself to do it. I can't do this anymore though. My heart is constantly racing. The slightest noise sends me into a panic. I get a security camera from my front door. I worry a little bit less when I hear the door slam from the wind, or when the dog barks at someone they hear. I'm becoming comfortable living in fear, as much as it is impacting my health. At least I have the pepper spray that John got me, and I carry it whenever I'm outside. Chris and I have shared accounts that we use for work. Maybe I can get an IP address from that. If it matches that, there's some proof, right? What if I send him an IP tracker? I've learned you can place an invisible pixel in an email, and it will send you the IP address of where it was read. All I have of Chris is his work email and Gmail. I test both on myself first, of course. I can't take the risk of him figuring out what I'm doing to him. And damn it, our work emails block it, and Gmail reroutes it to their HQ. Another dead end. More hours, days and weeks pass. I've called private investigators, and they're impressed. I've tried the tactics they already have at their disposal. I feel confident that I'm doing all I can, but more lost that the professionals can't help. 3 months later in February, it's my last attempt. It's a week before I have a 7-day out-of-country trip with Chris. It's on a large group this time, but I'll still be working very close with him. Too close. I send Chris an email with a shortened link that will track an IP address from where it was clicked from. I've tested this and it seems to work, but I'm shaking. What if it tips him off? What if he knows I'm onto him and he attacks me at work? What do I send him to get him to click? I find a local event that this particular breed of neckbeard would be interested. Hey Chris, I saw this and thought you might be interested. 5 minutes later, Chris replies, pure panic, no, excitement. Maybe a mix of both sets in. I don't care what he replies. I check the IP tracker. I got a hit. I'm shaking. I can barely type or hold my phone. It's the same IP address as the Facebook and FetLife hack I got. I have the proof I need. It's Chris who's been stalking me via my accounts. My intuition was right. As much as I didn't want it to, it confirmed that it was him. There's relief. A weight has been removed. But then it sets back. What do I do now? Go to HR? Back to the police? We've got this trip coming up. My team needs to be there when I do the job. I'll wait till I get back. It's not that bad. I'm used to living like this now. Johnny thinks I'm insane for considering it. He's right. I am. I've lost touch with reality. This situation has me unable to determine what levels of uncomfortable one can and should live with. All night, I debate the decision I've made. I won't wait. I'll do it now. I text my boss Jay the next day, asking him to meet me for lunch on Sunday. I need to speak with you away from the office. This is not a normal request. We're close at work, but this is bizarre to him. He tells me I'm scaring him, and I wish that I can tell him not to worry. The following day, we meet for lunch. I'm so nervous I could vomit. This is it. This makes it all real now. And I tell him everything. I'm worried that he may minimize the issue. Chris is just a kid, he didn't mean anything. I'll talk to him tomorrow. These are my worries. And after I finish speaking, Jay is at a loss for words. We have a plan in place to take this to HR tomorrow. And he is already helping me find someone to replace Chris on our work trip. Again, I'm relieved and nervous at the same time. Shit is going down tomorrow. 7 months of living in fear, and finally, I can see an end. Then comes Monday. My pepper spray is in my pocket. I picked a work outfit that would conceal it today. Jay calls me, asks me for a question. I don't remember what, but I take it as an invitation to go into his office. Anything to get away from the person I know, without a doubt, has been hacking and stalking me. Jay wasn't expecting me, but understood. The department head is in his office. Jay is about to inform him of my situation. Having my story told by a third party was surreal. I filled in the details where needed and gave them a folder of evidence, which I had collected to take to HR. Screenshots, IP addresses, written accounts of the timelines up to this point, the emails from Chris confirming his involvement, and the IP from the IP tracker. The day is a haze. I was at HR's office at least twice, saw the police drive through the campus, and had to fight my way with the HR director. He didn't feel that I had enough evidence to prove the email I sent to Chris's Gmail was actually the Chris that worked here. I dug through my work email. Bam. He emailed my work email from his Gmail account once. Enough evidence for our non-believers. Hours go by. It's almost 3 p.m. and I don't know what's going on. If I keep leaving my desk, Chris will know something's up. I can't call HR and ask, he'll hear the conversation. Chris walks over to me. Oh shit, he says. He's shoving his work phone in my face too close for comfort. He got an invite to go to HR for 4 p.m. I'm screaming inside. No one else is around. If he's going to do something to me, now is the time. That notice is the forewarning of being fired. That's how they do it at my job. I manage to look concerned and tell him, I'll let you know if I get one, insinuating maybe our team is being let go, not just you. He walks away, no idea where to. I sit at my desk shaking in fear. I don't know when he will return. How could HR betray me like this? They know the situation. Damn it, they should have warned me if they're about to send it. I could have fled. I could have been somewhere safe. Mike stops at my desk just to say hi and offer me some leftover catering. I can't eat right now. But in this moment, Mike has offered me so much more than just the leftovers. He has no idea of what's going on, but can see in my face that something is wrong. I ask to walk back to his office with him. Chris will never find me there. An hour or forever passes. It's got to be done by now. I know Chris will be escorted back to gather his things, and I don't want to be there for that. I sneak to Jay's office. He checks the area for me, and Chris is gone. Jay heard from HR. As per HR, I'm not allowed to speak to anyone as to why Chris was fired, which is ridiculous. Are they serious? This leaves me so vulnerable. If Chris decides to come back to work, no one would stop him. In fact, they would welcome him with open arms, and I'm left looking like the bitch that fired the nice, quiet kid. Later that week, the IT department took a few extra days to gather Chris's devices. I had time to look through them during the period. The days before our trip were one of so much discovery. Not just what I found on his computer, but what I learned from the people around me. The day after he was fired, I looked into his laptop. It had no issues of getting into his files. I was Chris's boss. I needed his work. His picture folders, a lot of personal stuff, stupid memes, vacation pictures, screenshots of the naked cam girls he chatted with, and me. Some pictures I had never seen before. Some I had. The pictures I was familiar with were from a cruise I went on months earlier with Johnny. Only, these were the ones I deleted. I had a GoPro set to take a picture every 10 minutes that hung from my wrist. While walking around, I inadvertently took close-ups of my ass in a swimsuit. Upon importing my vacation pictures, I deleted those from my computer. Were they still on my card? Then there were some pictures from my Google account. Well, it was pictures of a picture on a screen. He got into my Google account too? Why didn't I catch that one? Then the ones I'd never seen. Pictures that had been taken around the office and on work trips. Me at my desk. Me bent over, setting up gear. A close-up of a hint of cleavage shot from above. His phone was more of the same. A close-up of my arse when he sat behind me. Me struggling with an AV rack in a closet whilst in a dress. Videos from under a table during my meeting whilst I'm wearing a skirt. Zoomed in up the skirt. Pictures of dates I had written on a post-it. Pictures of my phone showing my FetLife account. The nausea sets in again. I remember all these moments in pictures he'd taken of me. Him nonchalantly on his phone, looking like he was slacking off or answering an email. Little did I know that he was filling his spank bank with images of me during work hours, and keeping a record of my days off. Creep. I got into his browser history. It was sickening. He researched how to hack someone's text messages. He stalked friends of mine on Facebook, as well as my partner. He got onto my Amazon, Gmail, Facebook, FetLife, work email, OkCupid and bank account. He read old emails of past relationships and stalked images from events I went to. There was hard evidence now. I took it to the local police near work. They couldn't handle it, so I went to the country prosecution office. Most people wouldn't think of that. It was suggested by Johnny's friends. They had a computer forensics department that could handle the case. I met an amazing detective. He took my packet of evidence and listened to the whole story. It's becoming easier to tell, especially when it focuses in on the facts. At my office, I learned more about Chris, how he slandered me to my co-workers. I know I couldn't tell the people I worked with why Chris was fired. But for my safety, I knew I had to tell a few people, just the ones close enough to me. Once they knew the story, I heard things from them like, Chris would complain I didn't pay him enough. He lied and said he made only half of what he actually did to his co-workers. I even fought to get him above normal raises for 2 years. He lied and said I would withhold work from him, and they usually responded to him by telling him to talk to my boss or HR. Obviously he never did. You can't take lies to HR nor directors. He spread lies around the office, coercing co-workers to take his side, when I wasn't aware that there were sides to be had. From these people, I learned more about the obsession Chris had with me. He craved to have power over me. He showed them my FetLife profile. He bragged about how compatible we are on OkCupid. He even spoke about being obsessed with my partner. He told them that he tried to catfish me. I couldn't blame them though. Chris laid the groundwork and a bit of gaslight on them. To them, I was a bad person, and Chris was their friend. Chris was really good at playing the victim, and was never able to take any self-responsibility. 9 months went by. I followed up with the detective often. It took a good while to subpoena his evidence from my company, then run forensics, and in early September I got a call from the detective. They arrested Chris. They showed up early one morning at his home, where he still lived with his parents, and he admitted to everything. He took the card from the GoPro and recovered the images. He got my password once, when I was walking away from my computer, and he went through my phone when it was left at my desk. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall. The shock to his family of the type of person who he actually is. Him, cowering whilst in handcuffs, face to face with what he'd done. No hiding behind a computer screen anymore. I was on vacation when that happened. I remember thinking, it's not long now till everyone at work knows. He's got a court date set. By then it's public record. I can't help if people know after that point. I didn't have to wait that long though. Later that day, co-workers started sending me a link. Hey, didn't you used to work with this guy? What a creep. The link was to a county prosecutor's PR page announcing Chris's arrest, mugshot and all. I came back to work and was able to have the truth come out. It was liberating. It took another 9 months for his final court date. I worked with prosecutors during that time to determine how I wanted to proceed. I opted for a probation period instead of going through a trial and fighting for jail time. Whilst Chris deserves the jail time, he wasn't worth my time nor effort, and a trial offered him a slim chance of getting off scot-free. Also, this way he would get some much-needed counselling. 3 years, no contact with me. 3 years sexual offence counselling. 3 years of checking in with a probation officer. This way, I can at least hope he will come out understanding with what he did was unacceptable, and fingers crossed, he will never do it again to a living human being. I know there was no chance of rehab in jail. It's worth mentioning that whilst this story takes place in a Southeast Asian city with a population of over 1.5 million, I didn't always live here. I was born and raised in a small town in the Midwestern United States. You know, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and we only gain attention during an election year. Anyway, my parents and I made the big move in 2014 due to a number of reasons. The biggest being so that my mother could be with her family, since this was her homeland. However, the town where all my relatives live is about 8 hours away. So we had to move to our city because it was the safest in the region for foreigners. And my dad is a white guy. Now, unlike every other college student in the world, I hadn't done much this summer. The heat was blistering all hours of the day, and I didn't have money to spend even if I was willing to leave our air-conditioned apartment. The only thing enticing me into the outdoors were the incessant sounds of construction due to a new unit being added to our complex. However, leaving was, of course, inevitable. So towards the end of the month, my parents and I went to buy groceries. The next day, my mum and I went out to buy some things that we had initially forgotten. And the day after that, the two of us went out again to pay some bills. That made 3 consecutive days of going out for the first time in about a month. To say I was exhausted was an understatement, and by 7 p.m. on the third night, I was already fast asleep on the living room couch. My mother woke me up at around 10 that night and told me to head up to my room. I was too tired to do my entire night's routines, so I quickly brushed my teeth and went upstairs. I noticed that my cat was already asleep in my bed, since he's basically my mother's shadow. So I got into bed whilst contorting myself into an angle that wouldn't disturb him. Cat lovers, you know what I'm talking about. I turned on a dim light, plugged in my headphones, and started playing a random video on YouTube, then eventually fell asleep. I didn't know what time it was, but I awoke to the feeling of my bed shaking. I tend to ignore movements like this, because they happen often when my cat sleeps with me, as he has a habit of scratching his ear. But there was a pretty strong earthquake just the night before, so I assumed it was another one, making me open my eyes and look down at my cat to see which of the two it was. Indeed, it was he scratching his ear, and my mother was also at the foot of my bed. Nothing out of the ordinary. She was probably checking on me before my dad and her went out on their 5 a.m. walk, as routine, and was bending down to pet the cat. I closed my eyes and was just about to slip back into slumber when my half-asleep brain remembered a number of things that were indeed out of the ordinary. With my eyes that were barely open, I looked at who I thought was my mother with blurred vision. The first thing I noticed was that she was wearing one of my high school t-shirts. My mother and I are far from the same size, and she doesn't have a history of borrowing my clothes. Weird, but not unsettling. Maybe she ran out of clean exercise shirts and decided to use one of mine. Then I noticed that she was also wearing one of my high school t-shirts, but this one was wrapped around her head in a way that outlined the shape of it, not covering anything, but just framing the profile. In my peripheral vision, I noticed that my closet doors were wide open. My mother always nagged me to close them, because she said it wasted the cool air coming in from the air conditioner, so I made sure to keep them closed whenever I wasn't getting ready. And another random realization hit me, when my brain finally registered the fact that while my mum does pet my cat when she comes in to check on me, she never bent down like the person was in my room. Looking back now, I don't think I've ever seen her bend down like that since I was a kid. Keep in mind, all these thoughts flooded my mind in about 5 seconds. Still, my half-asleep and half-stupid-ass brain was more focused on why my mother was wearing my clothes, as opposed to all the things that were off in this situation. That's when the person turned to look right at me before running out of my room, maintaining an ungodly crouching position that will be buried in my mind for the rest of my life. It wasn't until he was near the stairs that I fully processed what was happening. That person was not my mother, and they weren't even a female. Instantly I shot out of bed and instinctively wrapped my blanket around me to cover my nightclothes that suddenly felt so revealing. It was only then that I began screaming. I hesitantly followed him out of my room and watched as he ran down the wooden stairs with deafening steps that echoed throughout the 3rd floor, almost drowning out my piercing cry. If I was going to get my parents' attention, who was sleeping on the other side of the closed door on the second floor. I needed to be louder. I stood at the foot of the stairs and pushed my lungs to their limit. I could practically feel the capacity stretch inside my rib cage, and after what felt like ages, but was probably no more than 5 seconds, my parents' door swung open, and my mother ran up the stairs with a panic-stricken expression that I will never forget. She grabbed me by the shoulders and shouted, What's wrong?" I turned to look at her, my mouth agape, and my brows furrowed in a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Had she not seen the man when he ran right past their bedroom? It all happened so fast. I wasn't sure if they had crossed paths or not. I told them that someone was in the house, and I responded in a voice that honestly I didn't even recognize. Without missing a beat, she wrapped her arm around me and ushered me down the stairs. "Grab the gun," she shouted in the country's native language, and we ran into my parents' bedroom, where my father stood in the doorway, with tired eyes and slumped posture. I pushed him in the room and turned around to close the door, simultaneously fiddling with the light switch so we weren't in complete darkness. My movements were shaky and spastic, causing my fingers to fumble and flicker the lights on and off before eventually being able to lock the door. "What are you doing?" my dad asked with a soft laugh, as he switched on the lights after my attempts proved to be futile. I turned to him with the same incredulous expression I had when I was looking at my mum. He had been standing in the doorway to his room in perfect view of the running man, yet he seemed to be oblivious. "There's someone in the house," I repeated, watching his face instantly drop at my words. With the door now locked, I turned to my parents and watched them silently, waiting for them to say or do something. For 19 years they had taken care of me and catered to my every want and need. Now they stood, just as scared and defenseless as I was, and in that moment, they were just people. My dad, an infamous Type A personality, kept his focus on the floor, most likely processing the entire situation before deciding what to do next. My mother was the complete opposite. Her cell phone was in one hand, whilst the other, she was trying to run through her hair so many times that I'm sure the strands were going to end up between her fingers. "I can't call 911, it's not working," she said. I took the phone from her and dialed it myself, bringing the phone up to my ear, only to hear a monotone voice say, "Sorry, your balance is too low to make this call." In this country, most of the phones are prepaid, so if you don't have money in your account, you can't make any calls or texts. However, my mum said that she had added to her account a few hours earlier. I tried calling my aunt, who lives about 8 hours away, and it worked. And it was then that I figured that you can only use cell phones to call other cell phones, and you can't use them to call landlines, aka 911. The only problem was that our landline was on the second floor hallway, a few feet away from the other side of the door. I told my parents what our options were, and my mother opened the window and began shouting for help in her native tongue. Similar to a knee-jerk reaction, I instantly shut the window. "Don't do that, they'll know we're defenseless and come back." At the time this happened, we had been in the room for about 40 minutes, and I was convinced that if they had left and then heard screaming, they would come back because they would know we were sitting ducks. "Are you sure you saw someone? Maybe you were just dreaming," my dad said, this being his first string of words since barricading ourselves inside. How could he have gotten in? The door has 2 locks and a heavy pole across it. A little context about the pole. After the lock on our screen door broke, my mother had insisted on putting a metal pole across the door to ensure that no one would be able to get in. "No, I know what I saw," I answered without hesitation. But my brain started dissecting the possibilities of the figure simply being a fragment of my imagination. The sounds of movement he made were so vivid. but the situation as a whole seemed too surreal. There was no way someone can get inside with that pole acting as a shield, and neither of my parents had seen the man. Internally, even I wasn't 100% sure of myself, but on the outside, I stuck to my guns. I saw a man. Okay, then we need to get out of this room and call the police, my dad said. My overreacting got the best of me, and I thought about us leaving the room. Were there more people? Were they waiting for us? Were they right outside the door? Or were they hiding and would spring out when we least expected it? Maybe they were still in our apartment, continuing to raid through our things, since they know that we were too scared to leave. Had they heard my mother screaming for help and came back? We searched the room for weapons to protect ourselves with, but we wouldn't find anything even remotely useful. You may be wondering what happened to the gun my mother was shouting about earlier. It never existed. She just said that so the man would hopefully leave out of fear. So with half a pair of broken scissors in my dad's hand, and a small floor fan in my mother's, we prepared ourselves for whatever was on the other side of that door. My dad unlocked the door and swung it open swiftly, hoping to catch anyone out there off guard. The complete silence, mixed with the eerie yellow lighting coming from our hallway, seemed like a scene from a horror movie. Straight ahead, we all noticed that the door to the second floor balcony was wide open, and the screen on the window next to it had been pried open as well. The first feeling to run through me was assurance. Assurance of knowing that I wasn't crazy and hadn't just made it up. The second feeling to run through me was pure dread, knowing that I wasn't crazy and I unfortunately hadn't made it up. We searched the second floor and found no one and nothing. We then moved onto the first floor, and we found our pitcher of water dripping with condensation on the kitchen table. My mother asked me if I had forgotten to put it back before I went to bed, but I distinctly remember only brushing my teeth. I knew I hadn't gotten it out. Our windows have the glass on the outside and the screen on the inside, contradictory to typical American windows. And we saw that the glass windows were wide open and that the screen had been pried with. However, both of the locks on the door were bolted, and the pole was still in place. We figured that the man had initially attempted to come through by putting his hand through the small gap he made in the window screen, trying to reach for the door so that he could unlock it. However, I suppose his calculations were off, and he couldn't make the distance. That's when he climbed up to the second floor, probably by scaling the apartment that the construction workers had yet to finish, and did the same procedure to the balcony window. He was successful this time, because the distance was much shorter. We called 911 a total of 5 times, and it took them 45 minutes to get to our apartment, despite the fact that we live a 3-minute drive away. While waiting, my mother knocked on other apartments to let them know what was going on. Now, our complex consists of 4 different apartments. The first one is rented out to an online business company. The second is rented out to a family who had just moved in that exact night. We're in the third, and the fourth had no tenants. Neither of them answered, and it was probably because it was 2:30 a.m. The police came eventually, and told us that someone had made a call earlier, saying that they heard a woman screaming for help, but that they couldn't find the exact location of the screams. They searched the house, but found no one, and didn't even tell us how to file a report. Yeah, they were pretty useless. The next day, my mum spoke to the people at the first apartment, and they were obviously shaken up. They told her that they had heard her knocking, but that it's company policy not to open the door from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. My mother moved on to apartment 2 and told them what happened, and the man and his pregnant wife said that they didn't hear anything. despite going to bed at 2 a.m. and having all their windows opened. I was somewhat skeptical, because my scream was pretty loud, even giving my mother nightmares days after the incident, and all our windows and second-story door were open. There's another building just a few feet away, so sound resonates pretty loudly, making the construction booming even behind closed doors. And my mother's screams, that were enough to make someone call the police, I highly doubt they didn't hear anything. With the first apartment it made sense though, and all the windows were closed due to the air conditioning being left on. My mother told the couple to be wary of the construction workers because she believed that they decided to rob us, after seeing that my father was a foreigner, automatically assuming that we must be rich or something. The man's face instantly dropped and his tone turned cold. My mother asked him for the landlord's number, since the old number no longer worked, and he said that he would give it to her after he went to see her today, since he didn't have it on him. It took him 4 days to finally give it to us, and he did so with what seemed like a sincere apology, saying sorry for taking so long, and for what happened to us. That same day, we called the landlord, and she seemed shocked, telling us that nothing like that had ever happened in any of her apartments before. However, my mother had spoken with tenants in the apartment complex behind our own, which happened to be owned by the same landlord, and she says that she knows of at least 3 people in her complex who have had their place broken into. Later, the maintenance man came to inspect our windows, and we found out that the construction workers were hired because they're all members of our landlord's church, and the man, who just moved in with his wife, is the bishop of their church. Before my mother could even bring up her theory, the maintenance man told her that he was convinced it was the construction workers. We kept realizing that things were missing over the course of 2 weeks, like my backpack, some sunglasses, money, jewellery, some stuff out of our storage room, as well as other things. My phone was also taken. I assumed that's why he was crouching over my bed. He was trying to reach for both the phone and the charger, since I was probably laying on the wire or something. My laptop and camera were both sitting on my desk next to my jewellery box, but he didn't take those. My parents assume it's because he was going to take the heavier items when he was about to leave, so he wouldn't have to carry them around. However, I didn't see anything in his hand when he was running away from me, which makes me think that he either left the other items by the door for an easy exit, or there was someone else in the house helping him out. A few weird things. He took 4 of my shirts, 2 of them being exactly the same. He also went into my cousin's room and stole her towel. Thankfully, she had gone home for the summer, so she wasn't around, but it almost seemed as if the thief knew that. He went into her room and my room, but completely avoided my parents' room. I also couldn't get over the fact that he drank our water straight from the jug, which would have made sense since he climbed to the 2nd story. However, this country is notorious for being superstitious, and my mum said that thieves tend to leave water out because it makes the homeowners go to deep sleep. Something about water resembling the calming waves of an ocean. I've never been one to believe in superstition, and she thinks that's why I was able to wake up. Just a few hours after the incident, we decided that we were going to move back to the States. This wasn't the only occurrence affecting our decision, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm just thankful that we all came out safe and nothing worse happened. I'm also incredibly grateful for my cat, since he's basically the hero for waking me up. Against the advice of my parents, I started working at a bikini coffee stand when I was 17 years old, and continued working there until I was 20. If you're unfamiliar with bikini coffee stands, they are little drive-through espresso stands, usually painted in some neon colour, where all the employees wear lingerie or bikinis while they serve coffee. I know this sounds strange, and believe me, it is strange. However, the money was good, and it was fun at the time. Not to mention my parents really couldn't afford to pay for college. There is no loudspeaker where customers place their order. They simply drive up to the stand, order coffee, and make small talk as they oogle you in your skimpy ensemble. Within a matter of months, the boss gave me the busiest shift. The shift began at 4 a.m. and ended at 9:30 a.m. Though the coffee stand was not officially open until 4:30. I had to count the till, grind the espresso beans, fill up the sinks, and take stocks, clean if needed, etc. The coffee stand was situated in the corner of a large parking lot, sharing the enormous empty lot with only one other retailer. This retailer didn't even open until around 10 a.m, and so I arrived to the lot when it was completely dark, save for one dim street lamp above the stand, and the other in the far corner of the lot. I pulled up to the stand as I normally did, only this time it was my first shift alone. Normally I worked with one other girl, as this shift would get far too busy for one person. I had a routine with regular customers, as I literally worked every single day, as the boss wouldn't give time off unless requested. While I worked, I would see cars approach the stand, and know immediately which drink to prepare, based on my recognition of a regular customer's vehicle. After almost a year on the morning shift, it was rare to see a new vehicle, or meet a new customer. My boss was extremely strict about being fast and efficient, and would have us prepare drinks in advance for our regulars whilst they waited in the line of cars. My boss was so strict that for the first 6 months of my working there, he would watch constantly on his camera system and call me on the business phone to scream at me for lack of efficiency. After this, I became so fast at preparing drinks, I decided he guessed he would save money by having me work alone in the very early morning hours. So, like normal, I approached the stand and punched in the access code. I went inside and turned on some music right away to keep myself company. The street lamp directly above the coffee stand had burnt out a few days before, so it was rather dark outside. Coupled with the tinted sliding windows of the coffee stand and the knowledge that I was completely alone, I felt a little creeped out, though not nearly as creeped out and terrified as I would be in a few minutes. Even though the stand was technically open at 4:30, I wouldn't expect my first customer until about 4:45. I usually arrived at 4, but since it was my first shift alone, I came in at 3:30 to give myself enough time to complete all of the opening tasks. My first customer was always Dave. He drove a red sports car and ordered a double cappuccino heavy on the phone. He worked for the local Boeing plant and would brag about his high-ranking job in between awkward remarks about my body. You get used to that sort of thing after a while, but nothing could prepare me for this sort of thing that happened to me on that particular dark morning. Though many of our customers were pervy men like Dave, most of the early morning customers weren't as lecherous as one would expect. They simply needed coffee, and no other businesses were open as early as we. In fact, many of our morning customers were married women in soccer mum vans in desperate need of caffeine. I glanced up at the clock as I counted the money in the till. 3:50 a.m. I finished the count and walked from the back of the stand onto the main floor. There were 2 steps separating the back of the stand from the main floor. The back of the stand had no windows and contained a bathroom, large refrigerator, washer and dryer, etc. This is the area that my co-workers and myself would get ready and joke around where customers couldn't see us. As soon as we walked onto the main floor where customers could see us, uniform was required. Lingerie or bikini as well as heels. That morning I was wearing a matching pink lingerie set with knit stockings. The lingerie fully covered my breasts and buttocks, and provided more coverage than a typical bikini that you would see at a beach. I counted all of the syrup bottles. I opened the fridge and took stock inside. I turned on the espresso grinder and robotically poured in a bag of espresso beans. I started filling up the large commercial sink with soapy water, and the music played softly on the stereo. Then I heard it over the noise of the faucet, coffee grinder and the music. I wasn't sure I heard anything at first, so I just ignored it. But then I heard it again. Someone was tapping on the sliding glass window of the stand. I wiped off my wet hands and grabbed my cell phone. 4:15. We weren't open for another 15 minutes. I checked the light switches to make sure I didn't accidentally flip on the open sign. Along with the open sign, the stand was equipped with bright floodlights to illuminate the presence of the stand. Due to the sheer darkness of the morning, I had contemplated turning the floodlights on when I first arrived, but was strictly forbidden from doing so until the stand was open. Without the floodlights on, and through the tinted glass, I could not see who was on the other side. I stood there staring at the window. Maybe it's just Dave, I rationalized to myself. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. The tapping had definitely grown louder. I picked up the business phone and punched in my boss's number, as he had an extensive camera system complete with night vision, and could see in real time both inside and outside the stand. At the very least, he could tell me who was outside. The phone rang and no answer. So I flipped on the floodlights, walked over to the window, and saw the man, now illuminated by the bright lights. His head was pressed up against the glass, hands cupped around his eyes as he tried to see in. I jumped back. "Hi," he yelled through the glass. "Can I get some coffee? We aren't open for another 15 minutes, I'm afraid, and my boss will be mad if I open early." "Oh well, I can wait." The man then walked away from the window and stepped back into a small black Honda. I continued my opening duties, warily eyeing the black Honda. At the time I felt a false sense of security, lulled into the daily routine of my shift. However, this was different. At 4:30 I dutifully turned on the open sign and watched as the man in the black Honda drove up to the window. He was wearing a dark red baseball cap, a thermal shirt, and plaid pajama pants. I opened the sliding window. "Hi, sorry about that. What can I get for you this morning?" I said, trying to sound as normal as possible. The man looked at me for what felt like an eternity. "What I want doesn't appear to be on the menu," he said, not looking up from my crotch. "Okay, so I know what you're thinking. What did I expect working in this profession? Gentlemen?" I brushed his comment aside with a laugh. "We have a great white chocolate mocha." I looked around frantically. Where the hell was the usual morning guy Dave? I silently prayed another customer would pull up behind this guy. He looked away and stared at his steering wheel. "I want you to be my maid." "Excuse me?" I said, not sure if I heard him correctly. "I want you to be my maid. I want you to come over to my house wearing a maid costume with nothing underneath. I want to watch you, and if you don't clean correctly, I'm going to do whatever I want to you." He paused and gripped his steering wheel tightly. "I am not a nice guy." He looked up at me and smiled. Until that point in my life, I had never seen a truly sinister smile before. I slammed the long service window shut, ran to the back of the stand, hyperventilating at this point. I picked up the phone and called my boss repeatedly, with no answer, and I stood on the steps and peered out the window. The black Honda was gone, replaced with the familiar red of Dave's sports car. I never thought I would be happy to see pervy Dave, but here I was rushing to the service window to tell him what happened. I opened the window, all the while frantically relaying the story. Dave just laughed and muttered something about the guy dreaming. He told me I was being paranoid and the guy just had no filter. For some reason this put me at ease. Dave reached his hand out the window to place a $5 bill in my tip jar. He tipped this amount each morning. "Wow," he exclaimed. You just opened and your tip jar is already full. I know you make coffee, but it's not that great. Huh? I said, slamming the register shut. The tip jar rested on the outside window ledge, so customers could reach it. I had made a habit of leaving it outside in between customers, as it could get very busy. I leaned over and looked into the metal canister. Inside the tip jar was a long white envelope that appeared to be stuffed into its capacity. My stomach turned, as I knew it would be from the guy in the black Honda. "Dave," I said cautiously, "it's from the guy I just told you about. I'm not opening that." Dave sipped his cappuccino and suddenly his goofy demeanor turned serious. "You're right. Let me open it. I have gloves." It was late fall and rather cold. Dave put on his gloves in a dramatic manner, laughed about my paranoia, and proceeded to step out of his car, and he took the envelope out of the tip jar and opened it. "Holy shit," he said, his eyes widening. He held up a stack of $20 bills held together by a rubber band. On the back of the stack was a folded up piece of paper. He unfolded the paper and began reading it. His eyes grew wilder. His hands were shaking ever so slightly. What does it say?" He simply said, "Get dressed and call the police." I snatched the note from him, his jaw slightly agape. The note was laden with spelling errors and looked like it had been written by a child. Oddly, there were rather long words that were attempted but spelt incorrectly. It said some very deranged things. There are some things too sick to mention here, but I will relay the basic message as best I can recall. Some things you just never forget, even if you want to. You will come to my house. When you arrive, I will examine you thoroughly. And I will tie you to the post, and you will be punished for what you do. Every inch of your body will be bruised and sore. Afterwards, I will untie you and use you in every way possible. Just to mention, he used a different term, but it is extremely graphic and includes the word hogtied. You can scream, but no one will hear you. This is your first payment. Upon reading this note and taking this money, you have agreed to follow through. If you do not follow through, you are stealing, and you will be punished more severely than if you cooperated to this initial agreement. You will clean every inch of my house. There will be no more mistakes, or more punishment will follow. I got dressed and called the police and my boss, who finally answered. The police arrived, and I went to the station to explain in detail what happened. I handed them the note along with the money for evidence. The female police officer nonchalantly told me I should probably quit my job, that this behavior was to be expected from their customers, and I told them that I had never experienced anything like this before. My boss reviewed the outside videotape footage, and the footage showed the man standing outside the coffee stand, just staring inside. Occasionally it showed him leaning his head into the glass and cupping his hands around his eyes for better view. It also showed him rubbing his crotch. Apparently he'd been standing outside since 3:40, 10 minutes after my initial arrival. At one point, it showed him going back into his car to re-emerge several minutes later and finally tap on the window. I was shocked to realize that the man had watched me for almost a full hour without my knowledge. I felt stupid, but most of all scared. The footage also revealed that the man had his license plate covered with what appeared to be white paper. After reviewing the footage and the note, the police decided the man posed a potential threat, and that his behavior was not normal. They sent an undercover cop back in the stand with me. I was shocked that they wanted me to go right back into work not even 2 hours after the incident. The cop sat outside in an SUV whilst I worked. The plan was this: if the man drove through again, I was to flick the open sign on and off to alert him of the man's presence. I worked serving all of my regular customers, trying my best to pretend nothing happened. I was told not to recall the incident to any one of my co-workers or customers that morning, in case they knew the man and warned him of police involvement. The man did not return that day, but he did return. Little did I know this would be the beginning of a year-long nightmare. The stalking continued for a while, roughly a year. The stalker left, endless creepy gifts for me both at work and at my place of residence, all of which he signed off on as Turner. It got to the point where I couldn't prove it was him, because it would often be sent by a courier or a third party. He continued to come to the stand, and at one point he even promised to leave me alone. My co-worker was there, and we actually managed to have a very brief discussion in which he apologized and agreed that his behavior was inappropriate. However, he resumed just days later. The police were of no help, and kept insisting that it would all go away if I just quit my job. I had his license plates, and he was out of state, and vehicle description, but apparently the car wasn't even registered. Despite taking a leave of absence, the stalking continued. I didn't want to quit my job, as this was shortly after the recession. My mum, a sole provider for a family of 5, had lost her job, so I wanted to chip in and help her so that we wouldn't lose the house. Other bikini stands in the area were not hiring, due to being embroiled in prostitution scandals, all of which were heavily covered by the national media. You have no idea how hard it was, and maybe still is, to get a normal job after having worked as a bikini barista. Employers don't like it on your history all that much. The few of the scariest experiences included being assaulted at an ice freezer outside the coffee stand. Thankfully he didn't physically harm me, just grabbed and touched me inappropriately. Turner coming through the drive-thru completely naked and jacking off in a pair of women's underwear. Another incident occurred when my friend gave me a joint a customer had left me on her shift. Crazy it may sound, my regulars often left joints in my tip bar instead of money, as I liked to smoke a lot at the time. I asked my co-worker the customer's name, but she didn't get a chance to ask for it. I was told by my friend/co-worker that he had long hair and looked like a hippie, and this fit the description of a customer who would regularly leave joints in my tip jar. I smoked the joint before I went to sleep one night, only to have a massive freak-out full of hallucinations and hysteria. I thought I saw ghosts, demons and fire, and I ended up in the hospital. I found out in the hospital that, in addition to having marijuana in my system, I also had a bunch of PCP. Later on, Turner would take credit for this joint by sending a text to my phone, letting me know that if I wanted him to smoke me out, that we could get together sometime. I guess he thought that this weed was enjoyable. Of course, I gave his number to the police. I feel like I gave them enough information to get this guy. But I was never taken seriously, or they had bigger fish to fry. They did find out, however, that the phone he used was a burner. In this period of time, it was evident that one of my co-workers was sharing my personal information with Turner in exchange for money, or maybe just because she didn't like me. This co-worker was later arrested on prostitution charges, and I ended up relocating and changing my last name, which is surprisingly easy to do. I did this primarily to get away from Turner, but also so that I could get a fresh start with new employment history, and get away from the negative energy that had encircled my life. I had taken nude photos of myself and my boyfriend at the time, and after we broke up. He had leaked them to everyone on my contacts list, including my co-workers, and of course, this meant Turner most likely got a hold of the photos as well. It may seem strange to you, but after a while the stalking becomes part of your life. It's kind of like living around a bunch of rattlesnakes. You may feel constantly on guard and on edge, but eventually, you work your daily routine around trying your best to avoid the snakes so that you don't get bitten. When it happens, you do your best to move on. I've recently found out, within the last few months, that a man fitting my stalker's description was incarcerated some time ago for doing something even more frightening to another barista in the Pacific Northwest. There was also similar incidences and reports of a man driving through bikini stands naked, or with women's underwear. I suspect this man was most likely Turner. I could not be sure it's the same person, as I never was able to find out this person's true first or last name, but I am hopeful that it's him.